The chandelier in the Voss Grand Hotel lobby held 4,000 crystals, a fact Desmond Hale knew not because he had ever bothered to count them, but because the fabrication invoice had crossed his desk 11 years ago, back when the chandelier was still a line item in a renovation budget, and not yet the centerpiece of a lobby he was standing beneath in a facility's uniform that told everyone around him a version of who he was that happened to be true in the most. It was 7:42 on a Friday evening in October. By 8, the lobby would be filled with 300 guests in formal wear for the Voss Grand Founders Gala, an event that celebrated, with the specific enthusiasm of people celebrating a story they have not checked, the 22 years since Gerald Voss had supposedly built this hotel from nothing, and Desmond, who was not attending as himself, had spent the day finishing a punch list that had brought him into the building 9 hours earlier as a man named D. Hale from Facilities, a name that was accurate down to the letter and misleading in every direction beyond it. He had come in that morning the way he always came in, through the loading dock at 6, badge already printed by a system he had personally approved the specifications for, and had spent the day the way he spent every quarterly visit, moving through the building at the pace of someone who belonged in it in the one sense nobody in it understood. He had replaced a section of warped baseboard on the 9th floor. He had recalibrated a thermostat in the east wing that had been running 4 degrees warm for a month. According to 3 separate guest complaints, nobody on the management team had bothered to read past the subject line. He had eaten lunch, as he always did on these visits, in the small break room behind the kitchen with Nate Ferris, the hotel's chief engineer, a heavy-set, easy-laughing man of 47 who had worked at Voss Grand for 19 years and had never once, across 3 years of Desmond's quarterly appearances, asked a single question about where the quiet new guy on the rotation actually came from, because Nate Ferris was the specific kind of good, uncomplicated. "You're better with your hands than half the guys who have been here a decade," Nate had told him that afternoon, watching Desmond recede a door closer with the unhurried precision of someone who had done the same motion 1,000 times before it ever paid him $1. Desmond had said only that he'd had good teachers, which was true, and had let Nate believe it meant something smaller than it did. Nate had pulled 2 folding chairs into the loading dock doorway around noon, the way he did every visit, and split a thermos of coffee that was, by his own admission, terrible, and asked Desmond the same question he always asked, some version of whether he had people, a family, someone waiting on him at the end of a day like this one. A wife, Desmond had said, which was still true that afternoon in the strictest legal sense. Long hours for her too. Nate had nodded at that with the specific understanding of a man who had buried one marriage under his own long hours years ago, and had learned not to pry further than a nod allowed. "Tell her thank you for sharing you," Nate said, and went back to his coffee, and Desmond had let the silence answer for him, because there was no version of the actual truth that fit inside a lunch break, and because some part of him, sitting in that doorway in a uniform, found the plainness of Nate's kindness more honest than anything waiting for him at the gala that evening. He was closing his toolbox in the service corridor off the main lobby, badge still clipped to his uniform, when he heard his wife's laugh drift through the archway, the specific bright register she used in rooms where she wanted to be noticed being delightful, and he looked up to see Simone crossing the marble in a champagne-colored gown with Gerald Voss's hand resting at the small of her back with the particular ease of a hand that had rested there before and expected to again. Desmond did not move. He had learned, across 3 years of walking his own hallways as a stranger, that stillness told him more than any question would, and what the sight told him now was nothing he had not already suspected, and everything he had been patient enough to wait for confirmation of. Gerald saw him first, the way men like Gerald Voss saw anyone standing near something they considered theirs, as an object requiring classification before it could be dismissed. "And who do we have here?" Gerald said, in the tone of a man performing warmth for an audience of one, his eyes moving over the navy uniform, the tool belt, the scuffed boots, sorting Desmond into a category that required no further attention and receiving, in the sorting, a small private satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of a man confirming that the world is arranged the way he has always assumed it to be. Simone's face did something quick and involuntary, a flash of the specific panic that arrives when 2 separate rooms of a life suddenly share a doorway, and then she recovered, because Simone had always recovered faster than most situations actually required. "Oh, that's nobody, that's just the maintenance guy," she said, already turning her shoulder back toward Gerald, already laughing again, the laugh landing a half-second before the sentence had finished doing its damage, the way a slap sometimes arrives before the sound of it does. "Don't mind him." Gerald laughed too, the easy, unthinking laugh of a man who has just been handed a small joke at someone else's expense, and intends to enjoy it fully. "Efficient-looking crew this year," he said to Simone, already steering her by the small of the back toward the ballroom doors, already forgetting Desmond existed in the specific way people forget things that were never real to them in the first place. "Remind me to tell Facilities the runner in the east corridor needs replacing before the board sees it." Desmond picked up his toolbox. He did not correct her. He did not look at Gerald a second longer than the moment required, and he did not look at his wife at all, because looking would have cost him something he had decided. 3 years into carrying a truth neither of them had ever been trusted with, he was no longer willing to spend on a room like this one. He walked toward the service corridor with the unhurried gait of a man who had somewhere else to be, and if anyone had been watching closely, which no one was, they would have seen that his expression had not changed at all across the entire exchange, because it did not need to. He already owned the marble under all their shoes. He had for 3 years. Nobody in that lobby knew it yet, including in the fullest and most complete sense his own wife. Desmond Hale had met Simone Carter 5 years earlier at a hospitality industry conference in a hotel that was not his, a detail that had amused him privately at the time, standing at a coffee station between sessions, both of them reaching for the same carafe. She had been 29 then, sharp and funny in a way that surprised him, dressed a half step above everyone else in the room because she had already decided, even at that stage of her career, that appearance was half of advancement. She had asked him what he did, and he had given her the answer he gave everyone: holdings and hospitality investment, and she had laughed and said that was the vaguest sentence she'd heard all week. And he had said, without much thought, that vague was usually the most honest way to describe something people didn't have the patience to hear the whole shape of. She had liked that answer more than she understood at the time. They had exchanged numbers over bad conference coffee and dated for a year, and married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden that Simone had once described, in a moment of honesty she later regretted, as smaller than what she had pictured for herself, a comment she made 8 months into the marriage while looking at a wedding album belonging to a college friend, and Desmond had heard it and said nothing, because saying something would have required explaining a truth he had already. She had known at the time she said her vows, the version of Desmond that Desmond offered, which was true and incomplete in the specific way that all of his relationships with people who had not earned the whole truth were true and incomplete. He worked, she understood, in holdings and hospitality investment, the same vague sentence from the coffee station, unglamorous enough to invite no follow-up 5 years running. She had not asked what Hale Hospitality Group actually held. He had not volunteered it. And the years between the botanical garden and the gala had been the slow, ordinary work of a marriage narrowing under the weight of one person's ambition and the other person's silence, until the space between what Simone wanted to be seen having and what she believed Desmond was capable of giving her had become the entire shape of the relationship they were both, by different means, no longer really living inside. Simone had joined Voss Grand Hotel Corporate the year after the wedding, hired directly onto Gerald Voss's team as a junior brand coordinator at a salary that had embarrassed her when she compared it silently to the number she imagined a man like Gerald cleared in a year, and she had climbed with the specific hunger of someone who has decided that visible success is the only kind that counts, the only kind that photographs well, the only kind her mother would ask. Gerald had noticed her early, the way Gerald noticed anyone whose ambition could be made useful to him, and had begun what he called mentorship, and what was, from very nearly the beginning, something with a different shape underneath the name he gave it. The dinner that Renata Combs, 36, a colleague of Simone's in the marketing division and the closest thing Simone had to a work confidante, would later remember as the turning point, happened at a downtown restaurant 14 months into the mentorship, a place with tasting menus and a wine list Gerald ordered from without glancing at the prices. Renata had been invited along that first time as cover, the specific plausible deniability cover of a group dinner that thinned, over the following months, into dinners for 2 that were still labeled, on Simone's calendar, strategy sessions scheduled for 8, past the hour any actual strategy required daylight. Renata had said something to Simone in the restaurant bathroom that first night, quietly, the two of them at adjacent sinks. "You know this isn't about the quarterly deck," she'd said, watching Simone reapply lipstick in the mirror with the specific care of a woman performing for someone who wasn't in the room yet. Simone had laughed it off. "He's mentoring me, Renata. That's what this is." Renata had not believed her, and had said so twice more over the following year, at a birthday dinner and once, briefly, in a stairwell after a meeting, and both times Simone had told her she was reading too much into an old man being generous with his time, and both times Renata had let it go because it was not, in the end, her marriage to protect. A watch arrived 18 months into the mentorship, delivered to Simone's office in a box with no card, labeled by Gerald the following week, when she thanked him for it in the elevator, a bonus for exceeding targets, a claim human resources never processed as compensation because it had never come from human resources. Simone had noticed that discrepancy and chosen, in the specific way people choose not to examine gifts too closely, not to ask about it. A running joke followed not long after, delivered at company events with the specific cruelty of jokes that are only partly jokes, about how lucky Desmond was that Simone had settled for a man in facilities-adjacent work, a phrase Gerald had coined at a holiday party 2 years earlier and repeated often enough that it had become a kind of shorthand between them, a code neither of them needed to explain anymore. Simone had laughed at it more than once. Not loudly, but enough that Gerald had learned the joke would always land, and a man like Gerald Voss did not stop telling jokes that landed. Gerald Voss did not know the truth either, and this mattered, because the story only works if his contempt was genuine and not performed for Desmond's benefit. To Gerald, Desmond Hale was exactly what Simone had described him as at that same holiday party 3 years earlier, when someone new to the company had asked what her husband did. Something in property management, low-level, forgettable, a man who fixed things for other men who owned them. Gerald had filed him away accordingly, and never once in 3 years thought of him again outside the joke, which was, in its own way, exactly the arrangement Desmond had built his entire adult life around. Nobody who mattered to Gerald Voss's ego needed to know that 3 years earlier, when Voss Grand Hotel's debt had reached the specific number that turns a family legacy into a liability a bank stops extending patience to, it was Hale Hospitality Group that had quietly acquired 81% of the company through 2 holding entities, and a law firm bound by an NDA thick enough to survive a subpoena. The deal had been structured at Desmond's specific insistence to let Gerald keep his name on the building, his title, his corner office on the 14th floor, and the public myth that he had built Voss Grand from nothing. A myth that was, by the time of the gala, 22 years old and entirely unearned for the last 3 of them. Desmond had not needed the credits. He had needed the control, and control, done correctly in his experience, never required anyone to know you were the one holding it. The habit of walking his own properties incognito had started before any of it, back when Desmond was 22 and had spent a summer working the laundry room of a mid-tier hotel outside the city to cover the last of his tuition. The same summer his mother, who had worked hotel housekeeping for 11 years before the cancer took the rest of her time from her, had told him the only piece of advice he still repeated to himself 2 decades later. Reports lie. He kept a photograph of her, small, cracked at one corner from a move he'd made in his 20s, in the same drawer where he kept his passport and the incorporation documents for his first company. And every quarter at whichever property in the portfolio needed the clearest eyes, he put on a uniform and disappeared into it, not because he had to, not because the money required it of him in any practical sense, but because it remained the only version of his own. It was on the 3rd of these visits to the Voss Grand flagship, 8 months before the gala, that Desmond first noticed what he would spend the following months quietly confirming. An elevator lobby on the 9th floor, 11 at night, Simone and Gerald standing closer than colleagues stand at that hour, her hand briefly at his lapel in the specific gesture of someone straightening something that did not need straightening, the kind of touch that exists to be a touch and disguises itself as tidiness. Desmond had been pushing a cart of replacement bulbs toward the service elevator. He had not stopped walking. He had not needed to see more than that single, unguarded second, because a man who reads hallways for a living reads people the same way, in fragments, in the details nobody bothers to perform. And what he read in that elevator lobby was not an accusation he needed to make out loud. It was a fact he needed to verify, the way he verified everything without haste, because incomplete information produces incomplete responses, and Desmond Hale had built a $9 billion company on the specific discipline of never responding to anything incompletely. The verification took the shape it always took with him, quiet, procedural, thorough, entirely free of the urgency a lesser man might have brought to it. His internal audit team, 3 people led by a sharp, exacting 33-year-old named Priya Shah, who reviewed every property's numbers each quarter without knowing whose marriage those numbers might eventually touch, flagged an irregularity in Gerald Voss's discretionary spending account 4 months after the elevator lobby. Priya had brought it to him herself in his real office, laying 3 printed pages on his desk with the specific brisk neutrality of someone who has no idea the numbers she's presenting are about to become personal for the man reading them. 61,000 over 11 months, she said. Vendor account labeled corporate gifting. It doesn't map to anything in procurement. I flagged it as unusual, not fraudulent, until we know more. Do you want us to keep pulling the thread? Desmond had looked at the pages for a long moment before answering. Pull it all the way through, he said, quietly. I want the full picture before anyone else sees a page of it. Priya had nodded and left, and Desmond had sat with the report on his desk for 6 weeks before the gala, in the specific patient stillness of a man who already suspects what a document is going to tell him and reads it anyway completely, without skipping ahead, because the details are where the truth actually lies. He understood by the second full pass that the $61,000 and the elevator lobby were very likely the same set of facts wearing 2 different names, the watch among them, The private dining room reservations, 14 of them over the same period, none attached to a single client name Priya's team could locate in any calendar entry. He did not confront anyone. He did not tell Simone what he suspected, not out of cowardice, and not out of some appetite for revenge he was carefully cultivating in silence, but because Desmond Hale had learned a long time ago on a construction site and in 100 boardrooms since, that the moment you announce what you know, you lose the only advantage patience gives you, which is watching what people do when they believe no one is watching. So he kept going to the flagship in his uniform once a quarter, and he kept eating lunch with Nate Ferris, and he kept saying nothing. And on the night of the Founders' Gala, when his own wife looked at him standing in a lobby he owned and called him nobody in front of the man she was sleeping with, he understood it not as a wound requiring a response, but as the last data point in a file that had already quietly, in every way that mattered, closed itself. He drove home that night the long way, past the exit he usually took, because he wanted the extra 20 minutes to sit with what he now knew completely rather than mostly. And because a man who has just heard his own name replaced with nobody by the person who married him does not, even a man as disciplined as Desmond Hale, walk straight into his own kitchen and behave as though nothing happened. Simone came home after midnight, smelling faintly of the ballroom's signature cocktail and someone else's cologne, and found him at the kitchen table with a glass of water he hadn't touched. "Long night," he said, which was the only thing he said, and she said something back about the board being difficult, and neither of them mentioned the lobby, because she assumed he had already forgotten it the way he forgot most things that happened to him, and he let her assume that because it was, for 9 more days, still useful to him that she did. The divorce papers arrived 9 days later. Simone had them delivered to the flagship hotel's back office, where Desmond kept a small unmarked desk under the facility's designation for exactly the kind of anonymous administrative work that let him move through the building without questions, and she brought them herself at 4 in the afternoon, wearing the kind of composed, rehearsed expression of a woman who has decided a scene is going to go a certain way and has spent the entire drive over convincing herself of it. Gerald was 2 floors up at the time, in the middle of a vendor call, a detail Desmond happened to know because Gerald's calendar, like everyone's calendar in a building Desmond owned, synced automatically to a dashboard nobody at Voss Grand had ever been told existed. "I need you to sign these," Simone said, setting the folder on the desk between them without sitting down. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore, and I have a chance at a different life now, a real one, and I'd like to start it without any confusion about what this was." Desmond opened the folder. He read it the way he read every document that mattered, front to back, unhurried, while Simone stood with her arms crossed and her weight shifted onto one hip, the posture of someone who expects silence in return and has already decided in advance what that silence is going to mean about him. "The asset division is straightforward," he said finally, turning to the 3rd page. "There's an error here. You've listed my employer as Voss Grand Hotel, Facilities Department. That'll need to be corrected before anything gets filed. My attorney will want the language to reflect that I hold no employment relationship with Voss Grand Hotel. I hold a majority ownership position in its parent company." Simone's arms uncrossed slowly, the way a stance falls apart when the ground underneath it stops being solid without warning. "What did you just say to me?" "Hale Hospitality Group," Desmond said, closing the folder, "acquired 81% of Voss Grand Hotel 3 years ago. Gerald's title is real. The ownership behind it hasn't belonged to him in 3 years. My attorney is Aaron Whitfield. He can have his office call yours this afternoon if you'd like the corrected version by Monday." He watched her do the specific arithmetic that people in her position always eventually do, the vertigo of discovering that every room she had stood in for years had a floor beneath the floor she could see. "You let me call you nobody," she said, and her voice had lost the rehearsed evenness entirely, replaced by something rawer and less controlled. "In front of him. In front of everyone. You just stood there and let me say that." "You said it," Desmond said, and there was no heat in it, only the flat, complete accuracy of a man stating something he had already made his peace with. "I didn't correct you because I was not in the business of managing your embarrassment for you at a party. I still am not now. The building you were standing in that night belongs to a company I run. It has for 3 years. Nobody made you say what you said, Simone. You said it because it was already true, in the only way that ever actually mattered to you, which is what you believed about me underneath everything else, gala or no gala, watch or no watch." She did not respond to that directly. She picked the folder back up, held it against her chest the way a person holds something to keep their hands from shaking, and said, quieter, "Does Gerald know?" "Not yet," Desmond said. "He will Mondays." "Are you doing this because of him?" Well, she asked. "Because of us." I'm doing this, Desmond said, because a member of my leadership team has been misappropriating company funds for 11 months. What you and Gerald are to each other is a separate matter, and I intend to keep it separate, because mixing the two would make people question whether the fraud findings are real, and they are entirely real. He'll be shown the numbers. Nothing else. He paused. What happens to what you and Gerald are to each other after that is not something I'm going to manage either. Gerald's termination happened the following Monday, in a conference room on the 14th floor that Gerald had occupied for 22 years, believing it was his by right rather than by contract. And it happened on the numbers alone, exactly as Desmond had planned it from the day Priya's report first landed on his desk. Two other board members sat in on the meeting at Aaron's recommendation, a formality meant to make the proceeding unimpeachable rather than personal. Thomas Reyes, 61, who had sat on the Hale Hospitality Group board for a decade and said almost nothing the entire meeting, and a younger compliance officer named Farah Lund who took notes no one would ever need to reference because the outcome was never in question. Aaron Whitfield, Desmond's attorney for 11 years, a precise, unhurried man in his 60s who had built his practice on the specific principle that thoroughness outperforms aggression every time, presented the audit findings with the dry completeness of someone who had done this before and found no particular satisfaction in it either way. $61,000. 11 months. A vendor account that traced back to a jewelry consignment shop 3 blocks from the hotel, and a private dining room Gerald had reserved 14 times, without a single client name ever attached to the booking. Gerald blustered for the first 4 minutes, invoking 22 years, invoking his father, invoking the plaque in the lobby with his name on it, insisting the vendor account was a clerical oversight from his assistant's office, and went quiet for the remaining 11 because there is a specific silence that arrives when a man realizes the story he built his entire identity on top of was never actually structurally his, not for years, and every room he had walked into. You, Gerald said finally, looking at Desmond as though seeing him for the first time, which, in the way that mattered, he was. You're the one who bought this company. 3 years ago, Desmond said. 81%. The agreement let you keep the title and the name on the building because that mattered more to you than the 81% did, and I was willing to let it matter to you, as long as the numbers stayed clean. They didn't. Desmond, sitting at the head of the table for the first time in 3 years as exactly who he was, did not raise his voice, did not mention Simone, did not mention the elevator lobby or the watch or anything that belonged to the personal file rather than the financial one, because the fraud findings did not need help landing and mixing the two would have cheapened both. The building keeps your name on the founding plaque, he said when Aaron had finished. That part of the story is true and it stays true. Everything past page 1 of your employment contract does not. He slid a single-page separation agreement across the table, already prepared, already generous by any standard a lawyer would advise, and stood before Gerald had finished reading it, because there was nothing else in the room he needed to see happen. Thomas Reyes shook his hand on the way out and said only, clean, which from Thomas was as close to praise as the man ever offered. Simone did not attend the termination. She sent her own attorney instead 3 days later, to attempt a renegotiation of asset terms Desmond had already agreed to without argument, a request Aaron relayed to Desmond with the specific carefulness of a man delivering news he suspects will not be entirely welcome, adding that Simone had also asked through her attorney whether Desmond would be willing to speak with her directly just once before everything became final and unchangeable. Desmond thought about it for exactly as long as he thought about everything, without haste, weighing what he still owed to the version of himself that had meant every word at the Botanical Garden 4 years earlier, against what he now understood completely about the version of her that had needed a stranger's name to feel safe standing beside Gerald Voss, in a lobby that had never actually belonged to Gerald either. He agreed to one phone call on a Thursday evening and kept it short. She asked him, near the end of it, in a voice that had lost every trace of the composure she'd walked into the back office with 9 days earlier, whether any part of him had wanted her to find out sooner, whether the 3 years of silence had been in some way a test she had failed without ever being told the rules. It was never a test, Desmond said. A test implies I needed you to pass something. I didn't need anything from you, Simone. That was always the problem long before Gerald. You needed to be seen having something. I never needed to be seen at all. He let that sit for a moment, then added, because it was true and because he had decided, driving home that morning, that it was the last true thing he owed the conversation. I hope the life you're starting is the one you actually wanted, and not just the one that looked the most like winning. She was quiet long enough that he almost thought the call had dropped. Renata told me 2 years ago, she said finally, that it wasn't mentorship. I didn't believe her because I didn't want to. Desmond did not respond to that because there was nothing in it that required a response from him, and because he understood, better than she did in that moment, that the sentence had not really been meant for him at all. He signed the corrected papers the following Thursday morning at his own desk, the real one, on the top floor of the Hale Hospitality Group tower across the city, with his mother's photograph propped against the lamp the way it always was, the crack in the corner catching the light the same way it had for 20 years. He did not feel the specific triumph he might once have expected to feel, 3 years into carrying a truth nobody around him had been trusted with. He felt mostly the plain quiet of a man closing a file that had taken longer to close than it should have, and reaching, without any particular hurry, for the next one on the stack. He kept the uniform. He wore it again the following quarter, at a different property 2 states over, sat through a lunch break in a different loading dock with a different chief engineer who had no idea who he was talking to, and found in the plainness of it the same thing he always found there, the one version of his own life Desmond Hale had ever fully trusted, the one version nobody had ever once tried to sell him a story about, because nobody in that room had ever known there was a story.